A great negotiator never raises their voice. They raise the value of their silence. But here's the truth they don't tell you. The best negotiators don't actually care less. They've simply mastered the art of appearing unattached while strategically controlling every element of the conversation. What you're about to discover in this video isn't just theory pulled from textbooks. These are 50 battle-tested psychological principles used by FBI hostage negotiators, master deal makers, and the world's most successful business leaders. From anchoring bias to somatic awareness, from the tactical pause to the curiosity pivot, you're going to learn the exact mental frameworks that separate amateur negotiators from professionals who consistently get what they want. Whether you're negotiating your salary, closing a business deal, or simply trying to get your landlord to fix the heating, these skills will fundamentally change how you approach every conversation that matters. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let's build a global community of skilled negotiators. Now, let's get started with skill number 1. Skill 1, the anchoring preface. There's a concept in psychology called anchoring bias. It was discovered by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two researchers who spent their careers studying how people make decisions. And what they found was remarkable in its simplicity. The first number introduced in any negotiation disproportionately influences everything that follows. Your brain, efficient as it is, uses the first piece of information as a reference point. Even when that information is arbitrary, completely disconnected from reality, it still shapes your judgments. All subsequent comparisons flow from that initial anchor. This is why, in negotiation, whoever speaks first about numbers often has a subtle but significant advantage. When you introduce your preferred number before the other person can anchor lower or higher, you recalibrate their internal scale. You're setting the baseline from which all movement happens. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're selling a used guitar. It's in good condition, but it's been sitting in your closet for 2 years. You know, guitars like this typically sell for somewhere between $200 and $400. Now, you have two choices. You can wait for the buyer to make an offer. They might say $200. Suddenly, that's the anchor. The entire negotiation now happens in the space above 200. You're negotiating upward from their baseline. Or, you can speak first. You say, I've been offered $450 by someone else, but I'd rather sell it to you. Even if they negotiate down, and they probably will, they're starting from 450 in their mind, not 200. That's a fundamentally different negotiation. The anchor changes everything. It's not dishonest to set an anchor. It's strategic, because if you don't set it, someone else will. And their anchor might not serve you. The key is to introduce your preferred number first, calmly, as though it's simply the natural starting point for the conversation. When discussing price, timeline, expectations, any quantifiable element, be the one to name it first. You're not being aggressive. You're being deliberate. And here's what's beautiful about this. Once you understand anchoring, you see it everywhere. Car dealerships, salary negotiations, even the way restaurants price their menu items. The most expensive item on the menu? That's an anchor. It makes everything else seem more reasonable. Now that you know this, you can use it. And you can also recognize when it's being used on you. Quick pause here before we proceed further. If this type of valuable content is your thing, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Now let's proceed further. Skill 2. Reframing through contrast. Humans don't judge value in absolute terms. We judge it relative to what came immediately before. This is called the contrast effect, and it's one of the most reliable patterns in human perception. If I show you a gray square on a white background, it looks dark. If I show you the same gray square on a black background, it suddenly looks light. The square hasn't changed. Your perception has, because the context changed. In negotiation, you can use this principle deliberately. By presenting a worse option first, your real option seems more reasonable, sometimes even generous, by comparison. Let's say you want to leave work early on Friday. You need to be out by 3 in the afternoon. Now, you could just ask directly, can I leave at 3 on Friday? That's fine. It might work. But there's a more effective approach. You say, I know some people are requesting the whole day off on Friday, but would it be okay if I just left at 3 p.m.? Do you see what just happened? You created a contrast. Taking the whole day off is the larger ask. Against that backdrop, leaving at 3 feels modest, reasonable, almost like you're being considerate by not asking for more. The contrast makes your actual request feel smaller, even though nothing about the request itself has changed. This works in salary negotiations too. I know some candidates are asking for 120,000, but I'm looking at 110. The contrast anchors their perception. Your ask feels more grounded, more reasonable. The beauty of this technique is its subtlety. You're not lying. You're simply providing context, a reference point that makes your actual request easier to accept. But here's the important part. The contrast has to be genuine, or at least plausible. If you're applying for an entry-level position and you say, I know some people ask for 200,000, but I'm only looking for 60, you've broken believability. The contrast collapses. Use this tool with calibration and awareness. When used well, contrast doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like perspective. And perspective is one of the most powerful negotiation tools you have. Skill 3. The hypothetical future frame. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture yourself 6 months from now. The project you're working on now? It's finished. It's running smoothly. The problems you're facing today have been solved. You're sitting at your desk, or in your home, or wherever you feel most at peace, and you're looking back on this moment with satisfaction. What just happened in your mind? You engaged in mental simulation. And when people vividly imagine a future scenario, something fascinating occurs. Their brain begins to treat that outcome as more probable. Not certain, just more likely. The abstract becomes concrete. The distant becomes near. This is one of the most elegant tools in negotiation, painting a shared vision of success before discussing how to get there. When you describe a positive future together, you're doing several things at once. You're reducing resistance to the steps needed to reach that future. You're aligning both parties around a common goal, and you're making the outcome feel real before it exists. Let's say you're trying to convince a friend to join you on a trip. You could talk about logistics, flights, costs, schedules. That's the rational approach, but it's not the persuasive one. Instead, you say, picture us sitting by the water at sunset. No schedule, no obligations, just unwinding. We haven't done that in years. Their mind goes there first. They feel it. The warmth, the calm, the release. And once they're in that future, the logistics become secondary. Details to be solved, not reasons to say no. This works in professional settings too. Imagine 6 months from now, when this system is running smoothly. Your team has freed up 10 hours a week. You're focusing on strategy instead of putting out fires. What would that feel like? You're not making a promise. You're inviting them to imagine possibility. And imagination is the doorway to commitment. The key is specificity. Vague futures don't work. This will be great is empty. Picture yourself presenting this to the board and watching them nod because the data is undeniable. That's a future someone can step into. Use sensory language. Use time markers. Use emotional texture. Make the future vivid enough to feel real. When you do, resistance softens. Not because you've argued them into it, but because they've seen it for themselves. Skill 4. Label the obvious obstacle. There's a paradox in negotiation that most people get wrong. They think if they don't mention the problem, maybe the other person won't notice it. So they tiptoe around the obvious obstacle, hoping it stays invisible. It never does. The unspoken concern sits there, growing larger in silence. And worse, when you avoid it, you lose credibility. Because the other person knows you see it too. Your avoidance makes you seem either dishonest or naive. There's a better way. Name the concern before they do. This is called the paradox of transparency, and it's one of the most disarming moves in negotiation. When you label the obvious obstacle yourself, budget, timeline, trust, risk, you do several things at once. You signal honesty. You remove the tension of the unspoken. And you position yourself as reasonable rather than manipulative. Let me show you how this works in practice. Imagine you're asking your landlord for a repair. The heat hasn't worked properly in 2 weeks. Now, You know your landlord has been dealing with maintenance requests from multiple tenants. You know they're probably tired of complaints. That's the obstacle. Most people would ignore this context and just make the request. The heating isn't working. Can you fix it? But there's a more effective approach. You start with this. I know you've been dealing with a lot of maintenance requests lately, and I really appreciate everything you've handled so far. That said, the heating issue is making things difficult, and I wanted to see what we can do. You've just labeled the obvious obstacle. You acknowledged their burden before making your ask. And in doing so, you've made them feel seen. Understood. That shift in feeling changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. This works in professional negotiations too. If you're pitching a project but you know the budget is tight, don't dance around it. Say it, I know budget is a concern right now. Let me show you how we can make this work within your constraints. Naming the obstacle doesn't make it bigger. It makes it manageable. It transforms tension into honesty. And honesty, in negotiation, is a form of power. The obstacle is already there. You're not creating it by mentioning it. You're simply acknowledging reality. And when you do that first, you control the frame. Skill 5, the scarcity whisper. People are twice as motivated to avoid losing something as they are to gain something equivalent. This principle, discovered by Daniel Kahneman, is called loss aversion, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human decision-making. When something feels limited, fleeting, rare, or about to disappear, urgency rises. Not panic, not pressure, just a quiet sense that the window is closing. This is the scarcity whisper. It's not a hard sell. It's a gentle indication that time, availability, or opportunity has boundaries. The key is subtlety. When you push too hard, scarcity feels like manipulation. But when you simply state the truth, that your availability changes, that slots are limited, that the opportunity won't last forever, it triggers a natural response. Let's say you're offering freelance work to a potential client. You could say, let me know whenever you're ready. That's fine. No pressure, but also no urgency. Or you could say, I have 2 slots left this month. If that timing works for you, great. If not, we can revisit this in a few weeks. Do you hear the difference? You're not being aggressive. You're simply stating a fact. You have limited availability. But that fact plants a seed. The client now knows that waiting has a cost. Not a huge cost, just the cost of losing this month's availability. The scarcity whisper works because it respects autonomy while acknowledging reality. You're not forcing anyone's hand. You're just making the boundaries clear. This applies to more than business. Relationships, opportunities, even simple decisions. This arrangement works for me this week, but next week my schedule shifts. You're not threatening. You're informing. Scarcity is real in most negotiations. Time is finite. Attention is limited. Opportunities do have windows. The question isn't whether to acknowledge scarcity. It's whether to do it explicitly or let it remain invisible. When you make it visible, gently, you give the other person information they need to make a decision. And informed decisions, with clear stakes, happen faster. Skill 6, choice architecture. There's a famous study about jam. A grocery store set up a tasting booth with 24 varieties of jam. Customers loved it. They stopped, they sampled, they enjoyed the experience. But almost nobody bought anything. The next week, the booth offered only 6 varieties. Sales increased tenfold. This is the paradox of choice. Too many options don't empower people, they paralyze them. The cognitive load of comparing dozens of possibilities creates decision fatigue. And when people are fatigued, they often choose nothing. In negotiation, you can use this principle to guide decisions without forcing them. It's called choice architecture, and it's about presenting structured paths that make deciding easier while steering toward your preferred outcome. Instead of asking open-ended questions, when are you free? Or what do you think we should do? You present 2 or 3 clearly framed options. Would Tuesday morning or Thursday afternoon work better for you? You've just narrowed the field from infinite possibilities to 2 clear choices. You've made it easy. You've removed the friction. And you've maintained control over the frame. This works in larger negotiations too. Instead of saying, how should we structure this partnership? You present 3 models. Model A prioritizes speed. Model B prioritizes cost efficiency. Model C balances both. Which resonates with you? You've given them agency. They're choosing, but you've also shaped the menu of possibilities. The key is to make sure all the options you present are acceptable to you. You're not tricking anyone. You're simplifying a complex decision space into manageable choices. When people feel they've chosen freely, they're more committed to the outcome. Choice architecture preserves that feeling of freedom while making the decision process easier for everyone involved. Use it when scheduling. Use it when proposing solutions. Use it whenever you want to move from abstract possibility to concrete decision. Skill 7. The status quo bias nudge. Human beings are wired to resist change. Not because we're stubborn, though sometimes we are, but because change requires cognitive effort and carries risk. The brain defaults to existing arrangements because they're known, predictable, safe. This is called status quo bias, and it's one of the most powerful barriers in negotiation. But here's the interesting part. You can work with this bias instead of against it. You can frame your proposal as a minimal shift from current reality, which dramatically reduces perceived risk. Let's say you want to change a team process. The current system has everyone checking in on Friday afternoons. You think Thursday would work better? It gives people time to adjust before the weekend. You could propose this as a change. Let's move the check-in to Thursday. That might work, but it triggers status quo bias. People have to mentally compare the new system to the old one, evaluate risks, overcome inertia. Or you could frame it like this. What if we keep the same system, same format, same duration, same structure, but just move the check-in from Friday to Thursday? Everything else stays identical. You've just transformed a change into an adjustment, a tweak. The overwhelming majority of the system remains the same. That tiny shift in framing makes acceptance dramatically more likely. This works in personal negotiations too. I'm not suggesting we change our vacation plans. I'm just wondering if we could fly out one day earlier. Everything else stays the same. When you present your ask as a small modification rather than an overhaul, you're working with human psychology, not against it. You're acknowledging that the current state has value. You're just proposing a refinement. Status quo bias isn't the enemy. It's a force. And like any force, you can learn to move with it. Skill 8. The not yet reframe. The word no closes doors. It ends conversations. It creates disappointment and sometimes resentment. But there's a different word, 2 words, actually, that preserve possibility while still maintaining boundaries. Not yet. This concept comes from Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset. Not yet implies future possibility rather than permanent limitation. It replaces rejection with postponement. It keeps the door open. When someone asks you for something and you can't say yes, you have a choice in how you decline. You can say no, which feels final. Or you can say, not yet, but here's what would need to change. Let's say someone asks you to invest in their business idea. You're interested, but not ready. You could say, no, I don't invest in early-stage ventures. That's the end of the conversation. Or you could say, I'm not in a position to commit right now, but if you reach these milestones, say, 10 paying customers and 3 months of revenue data, let's revisit this conversation. You've just transformed a rejection into a roadmap. They know exactly what would change your answer. And you've preserved the relationship, the possibility, and your own boundaries. This technique works in both directions. When someone tells you no, you can ask, what would need to change for this to become a yes? Often, they'll tell you. And suddenly, you have a clear path forward instead of a dead end. Not yet is honest. It doesn't make false promises. But it acknowledges that circumstances change, that growth happens, that today's impossibility might become tomorrow's opportunity. In a world full of closed doors, not yet, is a window left slightly open. Skill 9. Priming through environmental cues. Before a word is spoken, the environment is already whispering. The lighting, the temperature, the comfort of the chairs, the noise level, whether you're meeting on neutral territory or in someone's domain. All of these factors, subtle, almost invisible, are priming the emotional state of everyone in the room. This is called the priming effect, and decades of research confirm it. Environmental factors unconsciously influence mood and decision-making. Warm lighting makes people feel more relaxed. Comfortable seating lowers psychological defenses. Neutral territory, a cafe, a park bench, somewhere that belongs to neither party, creates a sense of fairness and openness. When you negotiate in a cold, sterile conference room with fluorescent lights and hard chairs, you're fighting uphill. The environment itself is creating subtle tension. But when you suggest meeting in a quiet cafe with good natural light, soft chairs, maybe a warm drink, suddenly, the negotiation starts from a different baseline. The environment is doing half the work. I'm not suggesting you manipulate people with mood lighting. I'm suggesting you be intentional about context. Because context shapes outcomes. If you're negotiating something collaborative, a partnership, a creative project, choose a setting that feels open and comfortable. If you're negotiating something more formal, a contract, a business deal, choose a setting that feels professional but not intimidating. Pay attention to temperature. Research shows that physical warmth correlates with emotional warmth and increased trust. A cold room makes people literally and figuratively less warm toward each other. These details seem small. They are small, but negotiation is built from hundreds of small things. And when you control the small things, you shape the larger outcome. So before your next important conversation, ask yourself, where should this happen? What environment serves the outcome I want? And how can I make the other person feel comfortable enough to be open? The setting is silent, but it speaks. Skill 10, the temporal distance frame. Time does something interesting to the human mind. The further away something is, the more abstractly we think about it. And abstract thinking tends to be more optimistic, more open, less defensive. This is called construal level theory, and you can use it strategically in negotiation. When you suggest something uncomfortable, a difficult conversation, a challenging commitment, a change that feels risky, placing it in the future reduces resistance. It feels less immediate, less threatening. Let's say you want a friend to try something new. Maybe hiking, maybe a fitness class, maybe learning a skill together. They're hesitant. The idea makes them uncomfortable. You could push for it now. Let's do it this weekend. That's likely to trigger resistance. The commitment feels immediate. The discomfort is right there. Or you could say, how about we plan this for next spring? No pressure now. Just something to think about. Distance softens resistance. Spring feels far enough away that they don't have to defend against it. They can consider the idea without feeling cornered. And often, what feels impossible today becomes acceptable when framed as a future possibility. This works in professional settings too. Let's plan to revisit this conversation in 3 months is very different from we need to decide this now. The temporal distance frame gives people psychological space. It removes the pressure of immediacy. And paradoxically, when you give people space, they often move toward you more readily than if you'd pushed. Use this when introducing difficult topics. Use it when someone needs time to adjust to an idea. Use it whenever you're facing resistance that's more about timing than substance. Time is a negotiation tool, and distance, sometimes, is the most persuasive form of proximity. Skill 11. The pre-negotiation centering ritual. Your body is always telling a story. Even when you think you're hiding your nerves, your body language leaks it. The slight tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your voice, the micro-expressions that flash across your face before you can control them. The other person may not consciously notice these signals, but they register them, and they respond to them, unconsciously adjusting their own behavior based on the emotional state you're broadcasting. This is why what you do before the negotiation matters as much as what you do during it. There's a physiological principle at work here called parasympathetic activation. Your nervous system has 2 modes: sympathetic, which governs fight or flight responses, and parasympathetic, which governs rest and calm. When you're anxious or stressed, your sympathetic system is dominant. Your heart rate increases. Cortisol floods your bloodstream. Your thinking narrows. But here's what's remarkable. You can consciously activate your parasympathetic system through controlled breathing, through grounding techniques, through deliberate visualization. Before any high-stakes conversation, give yourself 2 minutes alone. Find a quiet space, a bathroom, your car, an empty conference room. Close your eyes and breathe. Not shallow breathing. Deep, intentional breathing. Inhale slowly through your nose for 4 counts. Hold for a moment. Then exhale through your mouth for 6 counts. The exhale is longer than the inhale. That's what signals your nervous system to shift into calm mode. As you breathe, visualize the outcome you want. Not in a magical thinking way, but in a grounded, realistic way. See yourself speaking clearly. See the other person listening. See the conversation unfolding with the tone you want to create. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're about to ask your boss for a raise. You've prepared your case. You know your value. But 5 minutes before the meeting, your heart is pounding. Your thoughts are racing through worst-case scenarios. You find a quiet space. You close your eyes. You breathe. 4 counts in. Hold. 6 counts out. You do this 5 times. With each breath, you feel your heart rate slow. The racing thoughts begin to settle. You visualize yourself sitting across from your boss. You see yourself speaking calmly, clearly. You see them listening. You're not suppressing the nerves. You're transforming them into calm focus. When you walk into that room, your body language has changed. Your voice is steadier. Your presence is grounded. You haven't eliminated anxiety. You've metabolized it into centered readiness. This isn't about perfection. It's about giving yourself the gift of 2 minutes to reset your nervous system before you need to be at your best. The negotiation begins before you speak. It begins with the state you bring into the room. Skill 12. Emotional labeling for yourself. There's a researcher named Matthew Lieberman who studied what happens in the brain when you name your emotions. He used fMRI scans to watch brain activity in real time, and what he discovered was remarkable. When you simply feel an emotion, anger, anxiety, fear, the amygdala lights up. That's your brain's emotional center, the part responsible for fight or flight responses. It's powerful, fast, and not particularly rational. But when you name that emotion, when you say to yourself, even silently, "I'm feeling anxious right now," something shifts. The prefrontal cortex engages. That's your brain's reasoning center. And as it engages, the amygdala's activity decreases. This process is called affect labeling, and it's one of the simplest yet most powerful tools for emotional self-regulation. When you name what you're feeling, you create distance between the emotion and your response to it. The feeling doesn't disappear, but it loses some of its grip. You shift from being in the emotion to observing it. In negotiation, this skill is invaluable because emotions will arise. Someone will say something dismissive. You'll receive an offer that feels insulting. You'll encounter resistance that triggers frustration. Your instinct might be to react immediately, to defend yourself, to argue, to match their energy with your own. But there's another option. In the moment you feel that heat rising, that surge of anger or indignation, you can pause internally and name it. I'm feeling disrespected right now. This is frustration. I'm anxious that this isn't going to work out. Just those few words, spoken only to yourself, create a buffer, a tiny space between stimulus and response. And in that space, you regain choice. Let me show you how this plays out. You're in a negotiation. The other person says something that feels like they're not taking you seriously. Maybe they dismiss your expertise, or they interrupt you, or they make a joke that lands wrong. You feel heat. Your jaw tightens. Your first instinct is to snap back, to assert yourself, to make them take you seriously. But instead, you think, "I'm feeling disrespected right now." That's all. Just naming it. And in that moment of naming, something shifts. The feeling is still there. You're not suppressing it, but you're no longer driven by it. You can choose your response. You might say calmly, "I'd like to finish this thought." Or you might let it go, recognizing it's not worth the energy. But either way, you're responding thoughtfully, not impulsively. Emotional labeling isn't about eliminating feelings. It's about creating enough distance from them to act with intention rather than reaction. Practice this. When you feel anger, name it. This is anger. When you feel fear, this is fear. When you feel excitement, this is excitement. The more you practice, the more automatic it becomes. And the more automatic it becomes, the more control you have over your own responses. Skill 13. The tactical pause. Silence is uncomfortable. When someone makes a statement, especially a provocative one, the social pressure to respond immediately is intense. We're wired for conversational turn-taking. Silence feels like a void that needs to be filled. But there's power in learning to sit with that discomfort. To delay your response not out of confusion or weakness, but as a deliberate strategy. This is called inhibitory control, the ability to suppress your automatic response and engage your executive function instead. And it's one of the most underused tools in negotiation. When you pause after a provocative statement, several things happen. First, you give yourself time to think, to consider your response rather than blurting out the first thing that comes to mind. Second, you signal that you're taking the statement seriously, that you're giving it consideration rather than reacting defensively. And third, this is the interesting part. You often create discomfort in the other person. That discomfort frequently causes them to self-correct, to soften, to fill the silence with elaboration or even a better offer. Let me give you an example. Someone makes you an offer that's far less than you expected, far less than what's fair. Your instinct is to argue immediately, to explain why that's unacceptable, to counter with your own number. But what if, instead, you just paused? You look at them, not with hostility, not with judgment, just a calm, steady gaze. You don't speak. You count to 3 in your head. 1, 2, 3. The silence sits there. It's awkward. They feel it too. And often, surprisingly often, they'll break the silence themselves. Or, we could maybe go a bit higher. I mean, that's just a starting point, obviously. What were you thinking? The silence does the negotiating for you. Because in that silence, they're forced to sit with their own offer, to hear how it sounds. And sometimes, just the discomfort of that is enough to prompt them to improve it. This doesn't always work. Sometimes silence is just silence. But the tactical pause costs you nothing, and the potential payoff is significant. The key is that your pause must feel intentional, not confused. You're not frozen in shock. You're considering, processing, giving their statement the weight it deserves before responding. 3 seconds is usually enough. Any longer, and the silence becomes aggressive rather than thoughtful. But those 3 seconds give you time to breathe, to think, and to let the other person feel the weight of their own words. Silence, used well, is one of the most powerful forms of communication you have. Skill 14, the energy mirror. Emotions are contagious. This isn't metaphorical, it's physiological. When you're in the presence of someone who's agitated, your own nervous system responds. Your heart rate increases. Your muscles tense. You unconsciously mirror their state. This is called emotional contagion, and it's one of the reasons tense negotiations spiral. One person's anxiety feeds the others. One person's defensiveness triggers reciprocal defensiveness. The emotional temperature keeps rising because each person is unconsciously matching and amplifying the other's energy. But here's the beautiful thing. Emotional contagion works in both directions. When you maintain steady, low arousal energy, the other person unconsciously matches that too. Your calm becomes contagious. This is the energy mirror, the deliberate choice to respond to high energy with low energy, to respond to agitation with steadiness. And when you do this consistently, you become the baseline. The other person's nervous system starts to regulate itself based on the calm you're projecting. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. A colleague is frustrated. They're speaking quickly, voice raised, words tumbling over each other. The problem feels urgent to them, and their body language is broadcasting that urgency. Your instinct might be to match their energy, to speak quickly in response, to meet their intensity with your own. This feels like engagement, like you're taking them seriously. But matching their energy only escalates. Instead, you do the opposite. You slow your speech. Not dramatically, you don't want to seem patronizing, but noticeably. You lower your volume slightly. You keep your body language open and relaxed. And you say, calmly, I hear you. Let's figure this out. Watch what happens. Within 30 seconds to a minute, their energy begins to shift. They start speaking more slowly. Their volume drops. Their breathing deepens. You've become the anchor, the baseline, and their nervous system is synchronizing with yours. This works because the other person's agitation isn't usually about you. It's about the situation. They're not trying to be difficult. They're dysregulated. And when you refuse to escalate with them, when you offer steady energy instead, you give them permission to regulate too. This skill requires discipline, because your instinct, driven by emotional contagion, is to match their energy. But when you train yourself to do the opposite, to meet high energy with low energy, you gain enormous influence over the emotional tone of the conversation. Calm begets calm. Tension begets tension. You get to choose which one you're broadcasting. Skill 15, the detachment lens. Here's a question. Have you ever noticed how much clearer you are when advising a friend than when navigating your own problems? When a friend comes to you with a dilemma, you can see the situation objectively. You're not tangled up in the emotions. You're not defending your ego. You can weigh options, see multiple perspectives, and offer wisdom that feels obvious from the outside, but was invisible to them from the inside. This is the power of psychological distance. And you can create that distance for yourself, even in the middle of your own negotiations. The technique is called cognitive reappraisal, and it's elegantly simple. You view the situation as if you were an outside observer rather than a participant. When you're in the middle of a negotiation and emotions are running high, when you feel offended, insulted, or threatened, your thinking narrows. The negotiation becomes about you, about your worth, your competence, your position. It becomes personal. But negotiations aren't personal, even when they feel that way. They're problems to be solved. And when you can see them as problems rather than threats to your identity, you make better decisions. So here's the practice. When you feel your emotions hijacking your judgment, pause internally and ask yourself, if my friend were in this exact situation, what would I advise them to do? Suddenly, you're outside the situation. You're advising someone else. And from that vantage point, the path forward is often clearer. Let me give you an example. You're negotiating a contract. There's a clause that feels insulting. It implies you can't be trusted or that your work needs excessive oversight. You feel offended. Your instinct is to push back hard, to make them remove it, to defend your reputation. But instead, you step outside yourself. You think, if my friend were reviewing this contract and felt insulted by a clause, what would I tell them? The answer comes quickly. You'd probably say, don't take it personally. Standard contracts are often overly protective. Focus on whether the clause actually impacts your work or your compensation. If it doesn't, let it go. If it does, negotiate calmly around the specific impact, not the perceived insult. That's clearer thinking, calmer thinking, and it's available to you in your own situation. You just have to create the distance to access it. This isn't about suppressing your feelings. It's about not being controlled by them. It's about recognizing that your ego and your judgment are not the same thing, and that sometimes, to access your best judgment, you need to quiet your ego for a moment. The detachment lens doesn't make you cold. It makes you wise. Skill 16, pre-commitment to boundaries. There's a concept in psychology called implementation intentions. It's shockingly simple, and it's one of the most effective tools for behavior change ever studied. Here's how it works. Instead of having a general goal, I want to eat healthier, you create a specific if-then plan. If I'm hungry between meals, then I will eat an apple. When the trigger situation arises, you don't have to think. You don't have to decide in the moment. You've already decided. You just follow the plan. This same principle applies powerfully in negotiation. When you pre-commit to your boundaries, when you decide in advance how you'll respond to specific situations, you're far less likely to cave under pressure. Because here's what happens in the heat of negotiation. Your thinking narrows. Pressure builds. The other person pushes. And if you haven't already decided where your line is, you might find yourself agreeing to things you later regret. But when you've mentally rehearsed your boundaries, when you've written down your non-negotiables and your planned responses, you don't have to make that decision under duress. You just execute the plan. Let me show you what this looks like. Imagine you're selling something, maybe a piece of furniture, maybe a service. You know your bottom line is $500. Below that, it's not worth your time. Before the negotiation, you write it down. If they offer below $500, I will say, I appreciate the offer, but I can't go that low, and I will be prepared to walk away. Now the negotiation happens. They make their case. They push. They offer $400 and explain why that's fair from their perspective. And here's where most people falter. In the moment, 400 doesn't sound that different from 500. They're already there, already invested in the conversation. Walking away feels harder than just accepting the lower number. But you've pre-committed. You don't deliberate. You don't recalculate on the fly. You simply say, calmly, I appreciate the offer, but I can't go that low. And if they don't move, you walk away. Pre-commitment removes the decision from the moment of maximum pressure. It transforms your boundary from something you have to defend in real time into something you've already decided. You're just following through. This works for all kinds of boundaries. Timeline boundaries. If they ask me to start before April, I will say no. Process boundaries. If they ask me to skip the pilot phase, I will insist we need to test first. Respect boundaries. If they speak to me dismissively, I will calmly point it out or end the conversation. Write these down before the negotiation. Be specific. Use if-then statements. And then, when the moment comes, trust your pre-committed self more than your in-the-moment self. Your future self will thank you. Skill 17. The gratitude reset. Negotiations can become adversarial without anyone intending it. Positions harden. Tension builds. What started as a collaborative conversation turns into a subtle contest of wills. And once you're in that mode, once it's become about winning rather than solving, it's hard to shift back. But there's a remarkably simple tool for breaking that pattern: gratitude. Research by Barbara Fredrickson on positive emotions shows that gratitude does something unique to your cognitive state. It broadens your thinking. It reduces defensive posturing. It shifts you from a narrow, protective mindset to an open, flexible one. And here's the key. When you express genuine gratitude in the middle of a tense negotiation, it shifts both parties. Because gratitude is disarming. It's unexpected. And it reminds everyone involved that this isn't a battle. It's two people trying to reach an agreement. The gratitude reset works like this. When you notice tension rising, when you feel the conversation becoming circular or adversarial, you pause. And you acknowledge something genuinely positive about the other person or the process. I really appreciate you taking the time to work through this with me. I want to say, before we continue, that I appreciate how thoughtful you've been about this. Thank you for being patient as we figure this out. It's not manipulation. It's not a tactic to soften them up. It's a genuine acknowledgement that cuts through the tension and reorients both of you toward collaboration. Let me give you an example. You're stuck in a circular argument with a client. You've both stated your positions multiple times. Neither of you is budging. The conversation is starting to feel futile, maybe even frustrating. You pause, take a breath, and say, before we continue, I just want to say I appreciate how thoughtful you've been about this. I can tell this matters to you, and I respect that. The shift is subtle but powerful. The client softens because you've just reminded them, and yourself, that you're on the same team. You're both trying to solve a problem. The tension doesn't disappear entirely, but it loosens. And in that loosening, movement becomes possible again. Gratitude isn't weakness. It's not concession. It's a reset button that works because it's rooted in genuine recognition of the other person's humanity. Use it when conversations feel stuck. Use it when tension rises. Use it as a bridge back to collaboration. Skill 18. The somatic awareness check. Your body knows you're stressed before your conscious mind does. Before you register the thought, I'm anxious, your heart rate has already increased. Before you consciously feel angry, your jaw has already clenched. Before you notice you're uncomfortable, your shoulders have already tightened. This is called interoception, the awareness of internal bodily signals. And it's an early warning system for emotional escalation. Most people are disconnected from these signals. They don't notice they're tense until the tension has already leaked into their voice, their posture, their micro-expressions. By then, the other person has already registered it and responded to it. But when you practice somatic awareness, when you regularly check in with your body during conversation, you catch emotional reactions before they become visible. And that gives you time to adjust. The practice is simple. Periodically, during any negotiation or difficult conversation, Scan your body. Are your shoulders tight? Release them. Is your jaw clenched? Relax it. Are your hands balled into fists? Uncoil your fingers. Is your breathing shallow? Deepen it. This takes seconds, and it's invisible to the other person, but it prevents your body from broadcasting stress signals that undermine your position. Let me show you what this looks like. You're mid-negotiation. The conversation is challenging but not hostile. You're focused on the content, what's being said, how to respond. But underneath your focus, your body is reacting. Your shoulders are creeping toward your ears. Your hands are gripping the armrests of your chair. Your breathing has become shallow and rapid. You notice. You don't judge it, you just notice. And you adjust. You consciously drop your shoulders. You release your grip. You take one deep breath. The other person doesn't see any of this. But your nervous system has just shifted from sympathetic activation, stress response, back toward parasympathetic activation, calm state. And that shift affects everything. Your tone, your clarity of thought, your presence. The body is not separate from the negotiation. The body is part of the negotiation. What you feel physically affects what you project emotionally. Check in with yourself regularly. Your body will tell you what you need to know. You just have to listen to it. Skill 19, the identity shield. Here's a hard truth about negotiation. Sometimes you need to make concessions. Sometimes the other person has a point. Sometimes your initial position isn't going to work and you need to adjust. For many people, this feels like losing, like admitting weakness, like proof that they weren't good enough or smart enough or strong enough. That's because their ego is entangled with the outcome. And when ego is involved, every concession feels like a threat to identity. But there's another way. It's called self-affirmation theory, developed by researcher Claude Steele. And the premise is elegant. When you remind yourself of your core values and strengths, things completely unrelated to the current negotiation, you become less brittle, less defensive, more able to make concessions without feeling diminished. The practice is simple. Before a difficult conversation, take a moment to think about something you're proud of that has nothing to do with this negotiation. I'm a good parent. I'm skilled at my craft. I've built a successful business. I'm a loyal friend. I've overcome harder challenges than this. That internal affirmation becomes a shield, not against the negotiation, but against the ego threat that comes from not getting everything you want. Let me give you an example. You're about to negotiate a tough contract. You know you might need to compromise on some terms. And part of you is worried that compromising will make you look weak or that it means you're not a good negotiator. Before the meeting, you take 60 seconds. You think, I've built a successful career. I've navigated harder situations than this. My worth isn't determined by this one negotiation. Now when you enter the room, you're less brittle. When you need to make a concession, it doesn't feel like a referendum on your competence. It feels like a strategic decision. Because your identity is secure. Your worth exists independently of this outcome. This isn't about arrogance or false confidence. It's about separating your sense of self from any single negotiation, so that you can be flexible without feeling weak, so that you can concede ground without feeling diminished. The strongest negotiators are the ones who don't need to win to feel valuable. Skill 20, the anger delay protocol. Anger is useful. It tells you something is wrong. It provides energy. In some contexts, it can even be strategically valuable. But in negotiation, expressed anger almost always works against you. It narrows your thinking. It triggers defensiveness in the other person. It shifts the conversation from problem solving to emotional management. And it often leads to statements you later regret. The key isn't to suppress anger. Suppressed emotions tend to leak out in counterproductive ways. The key is to delay its expression. This is called emotion regulation via temporal distancing. When you feel anger rising, you acknowledge it internally, but you don't express it in the moment. You defer the decision about whether and how to express it. In practice, this looks like saying, I need a moment to think about this. Can we take a short break and continue in 10 minutes? That's it. You're not hiding your reaction. It's probably visible anyway. But you're not allowing it to drive your immediate response. During that break, several things happen. First, the intensity of the anger decreases. Emotions have a natural arc. They rise, peak, and fall. By delaying, You give the emotion time to move through its peak. Second, you regain access to your prefrontal cortex, your reasoning center. Anger activates the amygdala and suppresses higher-order thinking. Time and distance allow your thinking to come back online. Third, you get to decide, with a clearer mind, whether the anger is justified and how, or if, to express it. Let me show you what this looks like. Someone in a negotiation says something that feels like a personal attack. Maybe they question your competence, or they make a comment that crosses a line. You feel fury rising. Your face flushes. Your first instinct is to snap back, to defend yourself, to make them regret what they said. But instead, you pause. You take a breath, and you say calmly, "I'd like to take a short break. Can we come back to this in 10 minutes?" You step outside. You walk. You breathe. You let the anger move through you without acting on it. After 10 minutes, the fury has subsided. It hasn't disappeared. You're still bothered by what they said, but you're no longer in the grip of it. You can think clearly. You return to the conversation. You might address what they said. "Earlier, when you said X, that didn't sit right with me. Here's why." Or you might decide it's not worth addressing and simply continue with the negotiation. Either way, you're in control. You're responding, not reacting. The anger delay protocol doesn't eliminate anger. It just prevents anger from eliminating your strategic advantage. Skill 21, the baseline red. Imagine trying to detect a lie without knowing how someone acts when they're telling the truth. Every gesture becomes potentially suspicious. Every pause might mean deception. You'd see patterns everywhere, most of them meaningless. This is why the baseline red is the foundation of all behavioral analysis. You need to understand someone's normal behavior before you can detect deviations that signal something significant. This principle comes from behavioral analysis work done in law enforcement, intelligence, and clinical psychology. The idea is elegantly simple. People have baseline patterns, how they naturally speak, gesture, make eye contact, and occupy space when they're comfortable and honest. Once you know that baseline, changes become readable. Without a baseline, a crossed arm means nothing. With a baseline, you know whether crossed arms are their default comfortable position or a sudden shift signaling defensiveness. Here's how you establish a baseline in negotiation. Spend the first few minutes, before you get into the substantial topics, in low-stakes small talk. Talk about the weather, their commute, how their week has been. Something light, something that doesn't trigger stress or strategic thinking. While you're having this casual conversation, you're observing. Not obviously, you're not staring or taking notes. You're just noticing. How fast do they speak? Do they use their hands when they talk? How much eye contact do they maintain? Do they lean forward or sit back? Are they expressive or reserved? These patterns are their baseline. This is how they behave when they're comfortable, when they're not under pressure, when there's nothing at stake. Let me give you an example. You're meeting a potential business partner for the first time. You spend 5 minutes chatting casually before diving into the partnership discussion. During that chat, you notice they use their hands frequently while talking. They make steady, comfortable eye contact. They speak at a moderate pace with occasional pauses to think. Their posture is relaxed, slightly leaning forward. That's your baseline. Now you transition into the negotiation. You start discussing terms. Suddenly, their hands go still. They're speaking at the same pace, maintaining eye contact, but the hands have stopped moving entirely. That shift tells you something. You don't know exactly what. Maybe they're uncertain. Maybe they're calculating. Maybe they're uncomfortable. But something has changed. That's your signal to slow down, to check in, to ask an open question that gives them space to express what they're feeling. The baseline red isn't about jumping to conclusions. It's about noticing change. And change, once you have a baseline, becomes remarkably visible. This is why good negotiators arrive a few minutes early. Why they don't rush straight into business. Those first few minutes of casual conversation aren't wasted time. They're data collection. They're establishing the reference point that makes everything else interpretable. Without a baseline, you're guessing. With a baseline, you're reading. Skill 22, the micro-expression window. Your face is constantly betraying you. Not obviously, not in ways most people notice, but in tiny flickers. Involuntary expressions that last less than half a second, revealing genuine emotion before your conscious mind can mask it with a more socially appropriate expression. These are called microexpressions, and they were extensively documented by psychologist Paul Ekman. What he discovered was remarkable. While people can consciously control sustained facial expressions, smiling when they're angry, frowning when they're amused, they cannot control the first flicker. That initial, involuntary expression tells the truth. In negotiation, this matters enormously. Because when you make a proposal, state a price, or suggest a term, the other person's face reveals their genuine reaction before they've decided how to respond verbally. The challenge is that these microexpressions are fast, a fraction of a second. If you're focused on what you're saying, on your notes, on anything else, you'll miss them entirely. But if you're watching, really watching, in the moment you present something significant, you'll catch them. Let me show you what this looks like. You're negotiating a contract. You suggest a price, $10,000. You watch their face in that exact moment. For a fraction of a second, maybe a tenth of a second, their eyebrows lift. Surprise. Then, almost immediately, they compose themselves. Their expression becomes neutral, maybe slightly concerned. And they say, "That's higher than we were expecting." But you saw the truth in that first flicker. The surprise wasn't, "That's outrageous." It was, "That's higher than I thought it would be, but not impossible." The micro-expression told you they're willing to pay it, even if they're going to negotiate. Compare that to a different scenario. Same proposal, but the micro-expression you catch is different. Their nose wrinkles slightly, their lips press together. Disgust or distaste. That's a genuine negative reaction. When they say, "That's higher than expected," they mean something very different. The words are identical. The micro-expressions reveal completely different truths. Now, here's what's important. You don't call out micro-expressions. You don't say, "I saw you were surprised." That's invasive and makes people defensive. You simply use the information to calibrate your approach. If you saw genuine interest or surprise, you might hold firm on your price, knowing there's room for them to come up. If you saw genuine distaste, you might immediately offer context or justification, or you might probe to understand their budget constraints. The micro-expression window is brief. But if you're present, if you're watching in the moments that matter, it gives you access to genuine reactions that words will never reveal. Skill 23. The gesture language mismatch. People lie with words far more easily than they lie with their bodies. Your conscious mind can craft a careful response. It can choose diplomatic language, strategic phrasing, socially appropriate sentiments. But your body? Your body often forgets to lie. Or more accurately, it's harder to consciously control. This is called nonverbal leakage, when the body reveals truth that contradicts the words being spoken. And in negotiation, these mismatches are gold. Because when verbal and nonverbal signals conflict, the nonverbal is almost always more honest. This principle is used by interrogators, therapists, and skilled negotiators worldwide. Words come from the prefrontal cortex, your thinking, planning, strategic brain. But body language comes from older, more instinctive parts of your nervous system. It's harder to fake. So when someone says one thing and their body says another, trust the body. Let me give you an example. You're negotiating with a client. You present your proposal. They say, "I'm comfortable with this. Let's move forward." The words are perfect, clear, affirmative. You could take them at face value and proceed. But while they're saying this, their arms cross over their chest. They lean back slightly in their chair. Their jaw is tight. That's incongruence. The words say comfort. The body says discomfort, defensiveness, or reservation. You have a choice now. You could ignore the body language and proceed based on their words. But that's likely to lead to problems later: hesitation, renegotiation, or backing out entirely. Or you could trust the nonverbal signal. You could say gently, "I appreciate that. And I also want to make sure we've addressed everything. Is there anything you'd like to discuss further?" More often than not, when you give them that opening, they'll admit, "Well, actually, there's one thing I'm not completely clear on." The body revealed what the words concealed. This works in reverse too. Sometimes words express hesitation while the body expresses openness. I'm not sure about this, they say, but they're leaning forward. Their hands are open. Their face is engaged. That's someone who's interested but wants reassurance. Give them that reassurance. The key is to notice the mismatch. When words and body align. When someone says they're excited and their whole body radiates enthusiasm, that's congruence. Trust it. But when there's a mismatch, always trust the body. It's telling you what the person is actually feeling beneath what they think they should say. Skill 24, the proxemic shift. There's an invisible bubble around every person. A zone of personal space that feels comfortable or uncomfortable depending on who's in it and why. This field was studied extensively by anthropologist Edward T. Hall, who called it proxemics, the study of how humans use and perceive space. And what he discovered was that people unconsciously manage their personal space in ways that reveal comfort or discomfort with the interaction. In negotiation, changes in physical distance are powerful signals. When someone leans in, moves closer, or reduces the distance between you, they're signaling engagement, trust, or interest. When someone leans back, pushes their chair away, or creates more distance, they're signaling discomfort, resistance, or disengagement. The beauty of proxemic shifts is that they're almost entirely unconscious. People don't think, I'm going to lean back now to signal discomfort. They just do it. Their nervous system creates distance from something that feels threatening or uncomfortable. This means proxemic shifts are remarkably honest signals. Here's how this plays out in practice. You're explaining a proposal. You're midway through, laying out the timeline and deliverables. You notice, and this is subtle, that the person across from you pushes their chair back slightly, maybe an inch or two. It's not dramatic, but it's there. That's a proxemic shift. Something you said triggered discomfort or resistance. You could ignore it and continue, but that discomfort will likely grow and you'll hit resistance later. Or you could address it immediately. You pause. You say, does this part make sense? I want to make sure I'm explaining this clearly. More often than not, they'll admit, actually, I'm a little confused about the timeline. Could you walk me through that again? You've just caught and addressed resistance before it hardened into a no. Proxemic shifts work the other way too. If someone leans in during your presentation, if they reduce distance, that's engagement. That's interest. You've hit something that resonates. Spend more time there. Elaborate. Let them feel that interest. The key is to stay aware of physical distance throughout the conversation. Not in a creepy, hypervigilant way. Just aware. Notice when distance changes. And when it does, consider what might have triggered it. People's bodies are constantly voting on the conversation. Leaning in is a yes. Leaning back is a maybe or a not yet. Pay attention to the vote. Skill 25, the voice tone decoder. Close your eyes for a moment. Listen to someone speak, not to what they're saying, but to how they're saying it. The pitch, the pace, the volume, the quality of their voice. You can tell if they're stressed, even if their words claim they're fine. You can hear uncertainty in a rising pitch, careful consideration in slowed speech, suppressed anger in clipped tones. This is paralinguistics, the study of vocal qualities beyond words. And it's one of the most reliable channels of emotional information we have. Words can lie. Tone is much harder to fake. Because tone is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, the same system that governs heart rate, breathing, and stress response. When you're anxious, your vocal cords tighten. Your pitch rises. When you're angry, your speech becomes clipped, your tone sharp. When you're uncertain, your pace slows as you choose words carefully. In negotiation, learning to decode tone gives you access to the emotional truth beneath the verbal content. Let me show you what this sounds like. Someone says to you, "Yeah, that works." Those three words could mean many different things. You need the tone to know which. If their voice is warm, expressive, with normal pace and pitch, then, "Yeah, that works," means genuine agreement. But if their voice is flat, monotone, lacking energy, then "yeah, that works," means resignation or lack of enthusiasm. They're going along with it, but they're not happy about it. If there's a slight rise in pitch at the end, almost like a question, "Yeah, that works," then it's not agreement. It's uncertainty masked as agreement. If the words come out quickly, clipped, with tension in the voice, then, yeah, that works might actually mean, I'm frustrated, but I'm agreeing to end this conversation. Same words, completely different meanings. The tone is where the truth lives. This is why phone negotiations are actually easier than email in some ways. You lose visual cues, yes, but you gain access to pure vocal information. You can close your eyes and listen not to what's being said, but how it's being said. In person, practice this. Listen to tone as much as content. When someone gives you an answer, check the tone. Does it match the words? If someone says, I'm excited about this in a flat, tired voice, that's incongruence. They're not excited. They might be interested or willing, but not excited. When you catch these tonal mismatches, you can respond to the real message instead of the stated one. You sound hesitant. What's your concern? I hear some uncertainty there. What would make this feel more solid for you? People appreciate being truly heard. And hearing tone, really hearing it, is one of the deepest forms of listening. Skill 26, the cluster rule. Here's a mistake that novice behavior readers make constantly. They see one signal and jump to a conclusion. Arms crossed. Must be defensive. Looking away? Must be lying. Touching their face? Must be nervous. But human behavior doesn't work that way. Context matters enormously. Someone might cross their arms because they're cold. They might look away because they're thinking. They might touch their face because it itches. Single signals, isolated from context, are almost meaningless. But clusters of signals, multiple congruent behaviors happening simultaneously, form reliable patterns. This is called behavioral clustering, and it's the difference between amateur mind reading and professional behavioral analysis. The rule is simple. Don't interpret a single cue. Wait for clusters. 3 simultaneous signals pointing in the same direction give you confidence. One signal gives you almost nothing. Let me show you the difference. Someone crosses their arms during your proposal. That's one signal. It could mean defensiveness, or cold, or comfort, or habit. You don't know, so you don't react. You just note it mentally and keep observing. Then they sigh. That's a second signal. Still not enough. Then they look away, breaking eye contact. Their jaw tightens slightly. Now you have a cluster, arms crossed, sigh, averted gaze, jaw tension, for congruent signals, all pointing toward discomfort or resistance. That cluster is reliable. That's not random. That's someone who is genuinely uncomfortable with what you just proposed. Now you can respond with confidence. I'm sensing some hesitation here. What's your concern? Compare that to reacting the moment their arms crossed. You would have been responding to potential noise rather than actual signal. The cluster rule protects you from overinterpreting. It requires patience. You have to observe multiple signals before drawing conclusions. But that patience makes your behavioral reading dramatically more accurate. This applies to positive signals too. Someone nods once. Could be automatic. But if they nod, lean forward, their pupils dilate, and they say, "Tell me more," with enthusiasm in their voice, that's a cluster of engagement. That's real interest. In negotiation, watch for clusters. Don't react to isolated behaviors. But when you see 3 or more congruent signals, trust what you're seeing. The body is speaking clearly. Skill 27, the pupil dilation cue. There's a signal your body sends that you have absolutely no conscious control over. You can't fake it. You can't suppress it. It's completely involuntary and completely honest. Your pupils. Pupil dilation and constriction are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. When you're interested, aroused, or engaged, whether positively or negatively, your pupils dilate. They expand. When you're disengaged, repulsed, or uninterested, your pupils constrict. They become smaller. This field of study is called pupillometry, and it's been used in psychological research for decades. The findings are remarkably consistent. Pupils don't lie. The challenge, of course, is that pupils are small. You need to be in relatively close conversation, across a table, not across a room, to notice changes. And you need to be paying attention at the right moments. But when you can see pupil changes, you have access to genuine, unfiltered emotional response. Here's how this works in negotiation. You're presenting a product feature or a proposal detail. You're close enough to see their face clearly. You watch their eyes, not in a creepy, staring way, just with attention. As you describe a particular feature, their pupils widen noticeably. Not huge. Pupils don't dilate dramatically, but enough to see. That's genuine interest. That feature landed. They're engaged. You don't mention it, but you note it mentally. And you spend more time on that feature. You elaborate. You give examples. Because their pupils told you this is what resonates. Later, you mention a different aspect. Their pupils constrict slightly. That's disengagement or disinterest. You don't belabor that point. You move on. The beauty of pupil reading is that it's completely involuntary. People can control their facial expressions, their words, even their body language to some degree. But they cannot control their pupils. Now, some practical notes. Pupil size is also affected by lighting. Pupils dilate in dim light and constrict in bright light. So if someone's pupils dilate, make sure it's not just because the room got darker. You're looking for changes that correspond with conversational content, not environmental changes. Also, certain substances, caffeine, other stimulants, can affect baseline pupil size. So take that into account. But when you control for those factors, pupil dilation is one of the most honest signals you'll ever read. It's your window into genuine interest or disinterest, engagement or repulsion. Use it when you can. And when you see dilation in response to something you've said, you know you've struck gold. Skill 28. The foot direction tell. Here's a fascinating thing about human behavior. We consciously manage our faces. We're somewhat aware of our torso and hand position, but we almost never think about our feet. And because we don't think about them, our feet tell the truth. This principle comes from studying orientation and intention. The direction your feet point reveals where you unconsciously want to go. Toward someone means engagement. Toward the door means you want to leave. It's a primal, unconscious signal that leaks constantly. People who study body language call this the feet don't lie. Because while you're maintaining polite eye contact and nodding along with a conversation, your feet might be angled toward the exit, broadcasting your desire to leave. In negotiation, this matters. Because you can be in what seems like an engaged conversation. Someone is maintaining eye contact, nodding, even asking questions, while their feet are telling you they want to be somewhere else. Let me give you an example. You're in a long conversation with a potential client. You've been talking for 30 minutes. They're still engaged, asking questions, responding thoughtfully. But you glance down briefly and notice their feet are angled toward the door. That's a tell. They're ready to leave. They're being polite, staying in the conversation, but their unconscious intent is to exit. You have two choices. You can ignore this signal and keep talking, risking that they become increasingly impatient and their impression of you sours. Or you can respect the signal. You wrap up gracefully. I really appreciate your time today. I know we've covered a lot. How about I send you a summary and we can continue this conversation later? They're relieved, grateful even. You've respected their unstated boundary, and you've ended the conversation on a positive note rather than overstaying your welcome. This works in the opposite direction too. If someone's feet are pointed toward you, they're genuinely engaged. Even if they seem distracted or they've said they need to go, their feet are telling you they're still interested. You have more time than you think. The foot direction tell is subtle. You're not staring at people's feet obviously, but in your peripheral awareness, notice, where are their feet pointing? Toward you? Toward each other in a conversation? Or toward the door? The feet will tell you the truth about engagement and intent when everything else might be performing politeness. Skill 29. The self-soothing gesture. Watch a person under stress and you'll see something interesting. They start touching themselves. Not sexually. That's not what this is about. Self-soothing. They touch their neck, rub their arms, stroke their face, play with their jewelry. These are called self-pacifying behaviors, and they're automatic stress responses. When you're uncomfortable, physically or psychologically, your body instinctively seeks comfort. And in the absence of external comfort, it creates its own. The touch releases small amounts of calming neurotransmitters. It's self-soothing, the same way a child might hold a blanket or suck their thumb. In adults, these gestures are subtler, but they're constantly happening. And in negotiation, they're incredibly revealing. When someone engages in self-soothing behavior while discussing a particular topic, that topic is a pressure point. It's causing them internal discomfort. Let me show you what this looks like. You're negotiating a project. You mention the timeline. We need this completed by March 15th. Immediately, and I mean immediately, within a second, they reach up and rub the back of their neck. That's a self-soothing gesture. The timeline just triggered stress. They might not even be aware they did it, but their body just revealed that the timeline is a problem. Now you have information. You can handle this in multiple ways, depending on your strategy. If you want to be collaborative, you soften immediately. I know timelines can be tight. What would work better for you? You've acknowledged their discomfort and offered flexibility. If you need to hold firm but want to reduce their stress, you might provide reassurance. I know that's fast. Here's why I think it's doable. You're addressing the pressure point without conceding. Or if you're being more hardball, you simply note it mentally. You know the timeline is their weak point. You can use that information strategically. The key is recognizing the gesture. Common self-soothing behaviors include touching or rubbing the neck, stroking the upper arms, touching the face, especially the cheeks or lips, playing with hair, rubbing hands together, fidgeting with jewelry or clothing. These aren't signs of deception necessarily. They're signs of discomfort. Something in the conversation is creating stress. Your job is to notice what triggered it and then decide how to respond. People are constantly self-soothing. Learn to see it. And when you do, you'll know exactly where the pressure points are. Skill 30, the stillness signal. Most behavioral signals involve movement, gestures, shifts, fidgets. But there's one signal that involves the absence of movement, and it's one of the most powerful: sudden stillness. This is called the freeze response, and it's primal. When animals encounter a threat, their first response isn't fight or flight, it's freeze. Complete immobility. It's an instinct designed to avoid detection. In humans, the freeze response still activates, not because we're literally hiding from predators, but because our nervous system treats psychological threat the same way. When we're processing something significant, something surprising, challenging, or important, we often go completely still. This stillness is different from normal pauses. It's total. The person stops moving, stops gesturing. Their breathing becomes shallow. Sometimes they stop blinking. In negotiation, sudden stillness means they're processing something important. It could be surprise. It could be careful evaluation. It could be internal conflict. But whatever it is, it's significant. And here's what matters. When someone goes still, your job is to not interrupt. Don't fill the silence. Don't elaborate. Don't backtrack. Just wait. Let me show you what this looks like. You're negotiating a partnership. You make your offer. You lay out the terms, what you're bringing, what you need from them, how you envision the split. They go completely still. Not uncomfortable fidgeting, not thoughtful nodding, just still. For 5 seconds, they barely seem to breathe. Your instinct might be to fill that silence, to explain more, to justify, to ask if they're okay. Don't. That stillness is deep processing. Something about your offer landed significantly. They're turning it over in their mind, weighing it, evaluating it. Interrupting that process disrupts their thinking and often leads to a default no, because you haven't given them time to reach yes. So you wait. You maintain calm, open body language. You stay silent. You let them process. Finally, could be 5 seconds, could be 15, they move. They take a breath. And they speak. Okay, let's do it. The stillness was them deciding. And by giving them space to decide, you gave them space to say yes. This doesn't always end in agreement. Sometimes they process and decide it's not right. But either way, the stillness signal tells you something important is happening. And your respect for that process, your willingness to let them think without interruption, often tips the balance in your favor. Stillness is the body's way of saying, this matters. I'm giving this my full attention. When you see it, honor it. Stay silent. Let them think. And more often than not, what emerges from that stillness is clarity and commitment. Skill 31. The BATNA visibility control. There's a concept that transformed negotiation theory when it was introduced. It's called BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And it's elegantly simple. Your power in any negotiation is determined by how good your alternatives are. If this deal falls through, what happens? Do you have other options? Are they good options? Or is this your only path forward? The person with better alternatives has more power. They can afford to walk away. They don't need this particular deal. And that freedom, that genuine willingness to walk, gives them leverage that no tactic can replicate. But here's the fascinating part. Your BATNA only gives you power if the other side knows about it. If you have incredible alternatives, but keep them secret, you're negotiating as if you have none. The other side will lowball you, push harder, offer less. Because from their perspective, you need this deal. But if they believe you have strong alternatives, if they think others are pursuing you, if they sense you're in demand, they treat you more seriously. They offer more. They negotiate more respectfully. This is BATNA visibility control. And the skill is in signaling your alternatives without bragging or threatening. Let me show you what this looks like. You're negotiating a freelance rate with a potential client. You have other prospects, a few inquiries that came in this week, another project that's in discussion. These are real alternatives. You don't say, "I've got tons of other clients lined up, so you better make this good." That's aggressive. It triggers defensiveness, and it often backfires. Instead, you say casually, "I've had a few inquiries this week, but I really like the work you're doing and wanted to prioritize this conversation first." Do you hear the difference? You've signaled that you're in demand. You have alternatives, but you framed it as choosing them, which is flattering rather than threatening. They hear, "This person is sought after. We should take them seriously. And they're interested in us specifically." That subtle signal shifts the power dynamic. They now know that you can walk away, that you have options, and that knowledge makes them more likely to offer fair terms, because they don't want to lose you to someone else. BATNA visibility control isn't about making things up. It's about making sure your real alternatives are appropriately visible. Not hidden, not exaggerated, just visible. And if you don't have good alternatives, then your job is to create them before you negotiate. Because power flows from real options, not imagined ones. Skill 32, the dependency reversal. Power in negotiation often comes down to a simple question. Who needs whom more? If they need you more than you need them, you have leverage. If you need them more, they have leverage. And most negotiations involve trying to figure out or shift that balance. The dependency reversal is about making them realize they need you more than you need them. Not through arrogance, not through threats, but by highlighting what you bring that they cannot easily replace. This is rooted in mutual dependence theory. Every negotiation involves some degree of mutual need. Otherwise, why are you talking? But the degree of dependence is rarely equal. And the person who can illuminate their unique, irreplaceable value shifts the balance in their favor. The key is identifying what you bring that's truly difficult to replace. Not just, "I'm good at this," but "I bring something specific that would take significant time, money, or effort for you to find elsewhere." Let me give you an example. You're negotiating a business partnership. Both parties bring something to the table. That's why the partnership exists. But you want to make sure they understand the specific value you contribute. You say, not boastfully but matter-of-factly, "I bring a network of connections in this industry that took me 10 years to build." That's a significant part of what makes this partnership valuable. You've just raised your irreplaceability. You've reminded them that networks aren't bought overnight, that relationships take years to cultivate, that if they walk away from this partnership, they don't just lose you. They lose access to a decade of relationship capital. That's dependency reversal. You've shifted the psychological calculus from, "We can probably find someone else," to, "This person brings something we can't easily replicate." This works in employment negotiations too. I've developed expertise in this specific technology stack that very few people have. That's part of why I think this role is a good fit. Or in consulting, I've worked with 3 of your competitors. I understand the landscape in a way that would take someone else months to develop. The dependency reversal isn't about bragging. It's about making your unique value visible. Because leverage comes from irreplaceability. And irreplaceability comes from offering something genuinely difficult to find elsewhere. Skill 33, the strategic concession. There's a principle in social psychology that's so powerful, so universal, that it shapes human behavior across every culture: reciprocity. When someone gives you something, you feel compelled to give something back. It's not a conscious calculation. It's a deep psychological norm. We're wired for reciprocity. Robert Cialdini documented this extensively. Even small gifts create a sense of indebtedness. And in negotiation, this principle becomes a strategic tool, the strategic concession. Here's how it works. You give something first, something that's low cost to you but valuable to them. That creates psychological debt. And then, when you make your ask, you frame it as reciprocal fairness. I gave you this. In return, could we adjust that? The key is making the concession strategic. You're not giving away things you need. You're giving away things you can afford to lose that matter to them. Let me show you what this looks like. You're negotiating contract terms with a client. You know they're anxious about the start date. They've mentioned several times that timing is tight for them. You say, "I'm happy to be flexible on the start date. We can begin whenever works best for your timeline." That's low cost to you. Maybe you were flexible anyway. But by explicitly conceding it, you've given them something they value. Then you continue. In return, could we adjust the payment schedule slightly? Instead of 30-60-90 days, could we do 30-45-60? It would help with cash flow on my end. You've created a trade. Your flexibility on their priority in exchange for their flexibility on yours. And because you gave first, the reciprocity norm makes them much more likely to agree. The strategic concession isn't manipulation. It's fair exchange. You're giving something real. You're asking for something real in return. But by structuring it as reciprocity, I'm giving you this. In return, could you give me that? You're activating a deep psychological principle that makes agreement more likely. This works in personal negotiations too. I'm happy to handle the kids this weekend so you can have time with your friends. Would you be willing to cover next weekend so I can take that trip? Give first. Make it meaningful. Then frame your ask as reciprocal balance. People feel the fairness of that exchange, and they respond accordingly. Skill 34, the negative leverage flip. Here's something Daniel Kahneman proved that changed how we understand human decision-making. People are more motivated by avoiding loss than by pursuing gain. If I offer you a chance to gain $100 or avoid losing $100, the fear of loss will motivate you more strongly than the excitement of gain. It's not rational, but it's human. This is called loss aversion. And in negotiation, it becomes a powerful tool, the negative leverage flip. Instead of emphasizing what they'll gain from reaching agreement, you illuminate what they'll lose from not reaching agreement. You make the cost of walking away visible. This isn't threatening. It's not agree or else. It's simply making explicit the downside that exists regardless of what you say. Let me show you the difference. You're trying to close a deal. The positive frame would be, if we move forward, you'll get X, Y, and Z benefits. That's fine. But the negative leverage flip is more powerful. I understand if this doesn't work out. The only challenge is that restarting this process, finding another vendor, going through evaluations again, will probably delay your project by another month or two. You're not threatening them. You're just stating reality. If they walk away from this negotiation, there are costs. Time costs. Opportunity costs. Starting over costs. By making those costs visible, you make staying in the negotiation more attractive. Not because you've pushed them, but because they can now see the full landscape, including what they stand to lose. This works in hiring negotiations. You're negotiating with a candidate. They're hesitant. You say thoughtfully, "I completely understand if this isn't the right fit. The only thing is, we're hoping to have someone in place by the first of the month, and restarting the search would probably push that back significantly." You've just illuminated the cost of saying no. The project delay, the restart effort, the time investment lost. The negative leverage flip works because it's honest. These costs exist. You're not inventing them. You're just making them visible. And once visible, they become part of the decision calculus. People will work harder to avoid loss than to pursue gain. Use that, not manipulatively, just honestly. Skill 35, the information asymmetry probe. In economics, there's a concept called information asymmetry. It means one party has more or better information than the other. And whoever holds more information holds structural power. If I know your budget and you don't know mine, I can negotiate more effectively. If I know your deadline and you don't know mine, I can use time pressure strategically. Information is leverage. The information asymmetry probe is about gathering information while revealing as little as possible. And the tool for this is elegantly simple: asking questions. Questions gather intelligence. They make the other person reveal priorities, constraints, fears, and needs. And while they're talking, you're learning without giving anything away. The key is asking open-ended questions, not yes/no questions. Questions that require explanation. What's most important to you in this arrangement? How are you thinking about timeline? What concerns do you have? These questions invite elaboration. And in that elaboration, they reveal information you can use. Let me show you how this plays out. You're considering a freelance project. Before making any offer, before revealing your rate or your availability, you ask, what's most important to you in this arrangement? What would make this successful from your perspective? They talk. Maybe they reveal budget constraints. We're working with a tight budget this quarter. Now you know price is a pressure point. Maybe they reveal timeline urgency. We really need this done before the launch in March. Now you know they're time pressured. Maybe they reveal quality obsession. We've had bad experiences with contractors who rushed. We need someone who'll get it right. Now you know they value quality over speed and probably price. Each piece of information shifts the power balance in your favor, because you can now tailor your proposal to address their specific priorities. You can emphasize quality if that's what they care about. You can offer timeline flexibility if they're time pressured. You can structure payment terms if budget is tight. And they've told you all of this. You didn't have to guess. You just asked. Meanwhile, you've revealed nothing. They don't know your constraints, your alternatives, your priorities. That information asymmetry gives you enormous tactical advantage. The information asymmetry probe is simple. Talk less, ask more. Let them fill the silence with information. And use what you learn to negotiate from a position of informational power. Skill 36. The Phantom Competitor. Human beings are remarkably irrational about scarcity and competition. When we believe something is rare or that others want it, we want it more, even when the underlying value hasn't changed. This is social proof combined with competitive instinct. And in negotiation, it manifests as the phantom competitor, the subtle indication that others are interested in what you're offering. The key word is subtle. You're not lying. You're not inventing competitors. You're mentioning, truthfully, that others have expressed interest. And that mention shifts perception. When someone believes they're the only one considering you, they negotiate more aggressively. They feel they have time. They feel they can push for better terms because where else are you going to go? But when they believe others are interested, that you're in demand, that there's competition, they negotiate more seriously. They move faster. They offer more because they don't want to lose you to someone else. Let me show you what this looks like. You're offering a service. You have had other inquiries. This is true. You mention it, but you frame it carefully. I've had a couple of other clients reach out about similar projects. I wanted to see if we could make this work first because I think it's a genuinely better fit for what you're trying to accomplish. You've done several things. First, you've signaled competition, others want you. Second, you've created urgency. They're not your only option. Third, you've made it flattering. You're choosing them. That combination is powerful. They feel the competition, but they don't feel threatened or manipulated because you've framed it as preferring them. The phantom competitor doesn't have to be phantom. It should be real. But the art is in how you mention it. Not as a threat, not as leverage, just as context that reframes the negotiation from, will they say yes to me, to will I say yes to them? That subtle reframe, making them feel like they might lose you, shifts power dramatically in your direction. Skill 37. The patience power play. Time pressure is asymmetric in almost every negotiation. One person needs an answer quickly. The other can wait. Whoever can wait longer holds more power. Urgency creates desperation. When you need to close a deal by Friday, you'll concede more. When you have no timeline pressure, you can afford to walk away if terms aren't right. That willingness to walk, to wait, to let time pass. That's leverage. The patient's power play is about never revealing urgency. Even if you need a decision quickly, you disguise it. Even if internally you're anxious for this to close, externally, you project calm indifference to timeline. Let me show you what this looks like. They ask, when do you need an answer by? Your instinct might be to be honest. Well, I'm hoping to have this settled by the end of the week. That's a mistake. You've just revealed urgency. Now they know they can wait. That time pressure is on you, that you'll probably concede more as your deadline approaches. Instead, you say calmly, no rush from my side. Take whatever time you need to feel completely comfortable with the decision. You've just flipped the power dynamic. You've signaled that time doesn't pressure you, that you're not desperate, that you can afford to wait. Often, paradoxically, this makes them move faster, because they don't want to lose you, because they sense that if they wait too long, you might pursue other options. The patient's power play requires discipline, because sometimes you do need an answer quickly. Sometimes you are under time pressure, but showing that pressure weakens your position, so you hide it. You project patience even when you don't feel it, because the appearance of patience gives you the power that patience itself provides. Time is leverage. The person who controls time controls the negotiation, and controlling time often means simply being willing, or appearing willing, to let it pass. Skill 38, the status equalizer. Hierarchical differences create tension in negotiation. When one person has higher formal status, more authority, more seniority, more prestige, it creates psychological discomfort. The lower status person feels defensive, maybe even intimidated. The higher status person might not intend it, but their status creates an asymmetry that makes genuine collaboration harder. The status equalizer is about deliberately flattening that hierarchy. If they have higher status, you acknowledge it without subordinating yourself. If you have higher status, you downplay it. Let me show you both directions. You're negotiating with a senior executive, someone with much more formal authority than you. The status difference is real. Ignoring it feels naive. But you don't want to be subordinate. You want to be collaborative. So you say, I really value your perspective on this. You've seen far more of these situations than I have, so your insight is helpful. You've acknowledged their status, you've elevated them. But you haven't diminished yourself. You've framed it as learning from experience, not inferiority asking permission. That subtle move equalizes the psychological playing field. They feel respected. You've retained your agency. The negotiation can proceed as a conversation between peers, not a supplicant asking for favor. Now the reverse. You have higher status. Maybe you're the client, they're the vendor. Maybe you're the employer, they're the candidate. The formal power is on your side. But power imbalances make people defensive. So you deliberately equalize. You might say, I'd love your thoughts on this. You're the expert here. You've just handed them status. You've acknowledged their expertise. You've framed the conversation as collaborative rather than hierarchical. The status equalizer isn't about denying reality. Status differences exist, but by explicitly managing them, acknowledging them without letting them dominate, you create conditions for better negotiation. People negotiate better when they feel respected as equals. Give them that feeling, regardless of formal hierarchy. Skill 39, the commitment escalation trap. There's a famous technique in influence psychology called foot in the door. It works like this. Get someone to agree to something small, and they become more likely to agree to something bigger later. Why? Consistency bias. Once we've said yes, we feel pressure to stay consistent with that initial commitment. Saying no later feels like contradiction. So we keep saying yes, even as the asks get larger. In negotiation, this becomes the commitment escalation trap. You start with tiny agreements so small they're almost meaningless, and you build from there. Each small yes creates momentum toward bigger yes. Let me show you how this works. You want approval for a major project. Big budget, significant resources, meaningful risk. If you ask for everything at once, resistance is high. Instead, you start small. You ask, do you think this general direction makes sense? Is this a problem worth solving? That's easy to agree to. It's conceptual. It doesn't commit them to anything. They say yes. Later, you say, since we're aligned on the direction, Should we explore what it would take to actually do this? Another yes. Still relatively low stakes. Then, if we're serious about exploring this, we need to pull together some data. Can we allocate a small team for preliminary research? Now they're committing resources, but they've already said yes twice. Consistency pressure makes saying no harder. Finally, the research looks promising. Given that we're aligned on direction, that we've agreed it's worth exploring, and that the preliminary data looks good, should we move forward with full implementation? By this point, saying no feels inconsistent. They've said yes at every step. The escalation has been gradual enough that each step felt natural. But you've led them from conceptual agreement to full project approval. The commitment escalation trap isn't deceptive. Each ask is genuine. But by structuring them as a sequence, each building on the last, you use consistency bias to create momentum. Start small. Build gradually. Let each yes make the next yes easier. Skill 40, the walk-away threshold. Here's a hard truth. The willingness to walk away is the ultimate form of negotiation power. If you're genuinely willing to say no, to walk away when terms aren't acceptable, you can't be pressured into a bad deal. Your boundaries are real, and that reality gives you leverage that no tactic can replicate. But here's the problem. In the heat of negotiation, boundaries blur. Pressure builds. You've invested time and energy. Walking away feels harder than it did before you started. And so people agree to things they later regret. The walk-away threshold prevents this. It's simple. Before the negotiation, you decide your absolute limit, your reservation price, the point below which you will not go, no matter what. And then, this is crucial, you write it down. You make it concrete. You pre-commit. Let me give you an example. You're buying a car. Before you go to the dealership, you decide, $18,000 is my absolute limit. Above that, the car isn't worth it to me. You write it down. You tell a friend. You make it real. At the dealership, they're skilled. They pressure you. They're at $19,500 and they're saying it's a great deal. They can't go lower. This car will be gone tomorrow. Every instinct says, just take it. You're here. You've spent an hour. 19.5 isn't that much more than 18. But you've pre-committed. You stand. You thank them. And you leave. Your pre-commitment saved you from a decision you'd regret. Because in the moment, under pressure, your judgment was compromised. But your earlier self, the one who decided 18,000 was the limit, had better judgment. The walkaway threshold works because it removes the decision from the moment of maximum pressure. You decide beforehand, when you're clear-headed, when you're not emotionally invested. Then, when pressure comes, you don't deliberate. You just execute. This works for any boundary. Price, timeline, terms, respect. Decide in advance what's unacceptable. Write it down and honor it. The power to walk away is the foundation of all negotiation leverage. But that power only exists if you're actually willing to use it. Pre-commit, then follow through. Skill 41, the three-level listen. When someone speaks, there are three conversations happening at once. Most people only hear one of them. There's the surface level, the actual words being spoken, the literal content. I don't think we can afford this right now. Then there's the emotional level, the feeling behind the words, the tone, the energy, the emotion being expressed. In this case, anxiety. And finally, there's the intentional level, what they're really trying to communicate beneath both words and emotion, what they actually want or need. In this case, they want what you're offering, but they're afraid of the risk. This framework comes from deep listening theory in psychology and counseling. The insight is simple but profound. Words are just one layer of communication. If you only respond to words, you miss the real message. Let me show you what three-level listening looks like in practice. Someone says to you, I don't think we can afford this right now. Most people hear only the words. They respond to the literal content. Well, we could look at payment plans, or maybe reduce the scope to bring the price down. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete, because you're responding to what they said, not what they meant. Three-level listening asks three questions. What are they saying? The words, cost is a concern. What are they feeling? The emotion, anxiety, maybe fear. There's worry in their voice. What do they really want? The intention, They want what you're offering. They see the value. But they're afraid of overspending, afraid of making a mistake, afraid of the risk. When you listen at all three levels, your response changes completely. You don't just address the budget. You address the fear. I understand. Making a financial decision like this can feel risky, especially when budgets are tight. What would help you feel more confident about the value you'd get? Do you see the difference? You've acknowledged the emotion, the fear. You've addressed the intention. They want confidence, not just a lower price. Your response creates space for them to express what they really need. Three-level listening transforms negotiation because it responds to the complete message, not just the surface. And when people feel understood at that deeper level, they open up. They trust more. They negotiate more honestly. Practice this. With every statement, ask yourself, what are they saying? What are they feeling? What do they really want? Listen to all three levels and respond to the one that matters most. Skill 42, the reflective loop. There's a therapeutic technique developed by psychologist Carl Rogers called active listening. And at its core is something elegantly simple, paraphrasing what someone has said back to them. Not parroting their exact words, not mimicking, but restating their message in your own words to show you've understood. This is the reflective loop, and it's one of the most powerful trust-building tools in negotiation. When you reflect someone's words back to them, when you say, "So what you're saying is," or "It sounds like," you do several things at once. You demonstrate that you're listening. You give them a chance to correct misunderstanding. And most importantly, you make them feel heard. And when people feel heard, something shifts. Defensiveness lowers. Openness increases. They start seeing you as an ally rather than an adversary. Let me show you what the reflective loop looks like. You're in a negotiation. The other person expresses a concern. The timeline you're proposing is really tight. I'm worried we won't be able to deliver quality work under that kind of pressure. Most people would respond with a solution or a counterargument. We could bring in additional resources, or I think the timeline is actually reasonable if we manage it well. But the reflective loop does something different first. Before proposing solutions, before defending the timeline, you reflect. It sounds like you're worried that the tight timeline might compromise quality, and that would create problems for your team. That's it. You've restated their concern in your own words. And watch what happens. They often respond with relief. Yes, exactly. Quality is really important to us, and we've had bad experiences with rushed projects before. They've just given you more information. They've deepened the conversation because you demonstrated understanding before jumping to solutions. The reflective loop isn't just about being nice. It's strategic. It slows down the conversation enough to ensure you're both talking about the same thing. It prevents the common negotiation problem where both parties are having different conversations without realizing it. And it builds trust because people desperately want to feel understood. When you give them that, when you show through reflection that you've truly grasped their concern, they become more willing to work with you. Use the reflective loop regularly. After someone shares a concern, a priority, or a position, pause and reflect it back. So what I'm hearing is, or it sounds like you're saying, give them a chance to confirm or correct. And in that confirmation, you build alignment and trust. Skill 43, the silence invitation. Silence is uncomfortable. We're wired for conversational turn-taking. When someone stops speaking, social pressure demands that someone else start. The silence feels like a void that needs filling. Most people fill it immediately. They rush to respond, to keep the conversation flowing, to avoid the awkwardness of quiet. But there's enormous power in resisting that urge, in letting silence sit, in waiting. This is the silence invitation. After asking a key question, you stop talking. You don't elaborate. You don't clarify. You don't fill the void. You just wait. And in that silence, the other person feels compelled to speak, to fill the uncomfortable void. And often, what comes out in that space is more honest, more revealing than what they would have said if you'd kept talking. This principle comes from interrogation psychology, therapy, and hostage negotiation. Silence creates pressure, not aggressive pressure, just the natural discomfort of an unfilled conversational space. And people resolve that discomfort by speaking. Let me show you what the silence invitation looks like. You're in a negotiation. You ask a crucial question. What's your biggest concern about this proposal? Then you stop. You don't add. Is it the price? The timeline? The scope? You don't give them options. You don't fill the silence with elaboration. You just ask the question and wait. 3 seconds pass. 5 seconds. Maybe 10. It feels longer than it is. The silence sits there, heavy. And then they speak. And often, what they say is different from what they would have said if you'd kept talking. More honest. More vulnerable. More revealing. Honestly, I'm not sure my team has the capacity to implement this right now. We're stretched pretty thin. That's information you wouldn't have gotten if you'd filled the silence. That's the real concern, beneath whatever surface objection they might have offered. The silence invitation works because it transfers the pressure of the conversation to them. Instead of you doing the work of explaining, justifying, or elaborating, they do the work of filling the void. And in doing that work, they often reveal more than they intended. This requires discipline, because silence is uncomfortable for you too. Your instinct is to fill it, to help them, to ease the awkwardness. Resist that instinct. Ask your question, then be quiet. Maintain comfortable, expect an eye contact. Wait, let them fill the silence. More often than not, what fills it is valuable information you wouldn't have gotten any other way. Skill 44. The emotion behind the position. In negotiation theory, there's a crucial distinction: positions versus interests. A position is what someone says they want. I need the project completed by March 1st. An interest is why they want it. We have a product launch on March 15th and need 2 weeks for internal testing. Positions are often fixed. They sound non-negotiable. But interests, the underlying reasons, are usually more flexible. And when you understand the interest, you can often find creative solutions that the position would never allow. This concept comes from Fisher and Urey's work on principled negotiation. And the skill is learning to hear the emotion and intention behind stated positions. When someone takes a firm position, when they dig in on a specific requirement or demand, your instinct might be to argue with the position, to explain why it won't work, to counter with your own position. But there's a more effective approach. Ask about the interest behind it. Help me understand. What's important to you about that? What's driving that timeline? What problem are you trying to solve with this requirement? These questions invite them to explain the why, not just the what. And in explaining why, they often reveal flexibility they didn't know they had. Let me give you an example. You're negotiating a contract. The client insists on a delivery date. We need this by February 15th. That's non-negotiable. That's a position. It sounds fixed. You could argue, February 15th is really tight. We need at least until March 1st. Now you're in positional bargaining, your position versus theirs. But instead, you ask about the interest. Help me understand. What's driving that February 15th date? What happens if we miss it? They explain, we have a board meeting on February 20th where we're presenting this work. We need a few days to review it internally before then. Suddenly, the February 15th date isn't actually the real requirement. The real requirement is having something ready to present on the 20th with internal review time. Now you can problem solve. What if we deliver a draft by February 12th for your internal review and then incorporate feedback by the 18th? That gives you time to prepare for the board meeting and gives us a bit more breathing room on the final version. You've met their interest, being ready for the board meeting, without being constrained by their initial position. The emotion behind the position is always more negotiable than the position itself. Learn to ask why. Learn to uncover the underlying interest. And when you do, solutions appear that positional bargaining would never reveal. Skill 45. The calibrated question. There's a type of question that changes the entire dynamic of a negotiation. It comes from Chris Voss's work with the FBI's hostage negotiation unit, and it's called the calibrated question. A calibrated question is open-ended, starts with how or what, and invites collaboration rather than triggering defensiveness. The magic is in the framing. Instead of making statements or accusations, you ask questions that require the other person to think, to explain, to problem solve with you. How can we make this work? What would it take to get this done? How do you see us moving forward? These questions do something remarkable. They transform the negotiation from adversarial to collaborative, from me versus you to us versus the problem. And they're non-threatening. You're not accusing them of being unreasonable. You're not saying they're wrong. You're simply asking for their help in finding a solution. Let me show you the difference. Imagine someone proposes something that won't work, maybe a timeline that's impossibly short, or terms that are completely unbalanced. Your instinct might be to say, that won't work. That's unreasonable. That's confrontational. It puts them on the defensive. Now they have to defend their proposal, which means they become more attached to it. But a calibrated question approaches it differently. How do you see this playing out logistically? Or what would need to happen for this to work? You're not arguing. You're asking them to think through their own proposal. And often, remarkably often, they'll self-correct. Well, I guess when you put it that way, the timeline is pretty aggressive. Maybe we need to build in more buffer. They just negotiated themselves into a more reasonable position. Not because you argued with them, but because you asked them to think it through. Calibrated questions work because they engage the other person's intelligence. They treat them as a collaborator in solving the problem. And people are much more willing to modify their positions when they arrive at the modification themselves. Practice replacing statements with calibrated questions. Instead of "that price is too high," ask, "how did you arrive at that number?" Instead of "that won't work," ask, "how would we make that work?" Instead of "you're being unreasonable," ask, "what am I missing?" Calibrated questions transform confrontation into collaboration. And collaboration is where the best negotiations happen. Skill 46, the minimal encourager. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a conversation is almost nothing. A small nod, a brief hum, a quiet "I see." These tiny signals, called minimal encouragers or backchanneling, keep the other person talking without interrupting their flow. The principle is simple. People need to feel heard to keep sharing. But interrupting, even to show understanding or agreement, disrupts their train of thought. They lose momentum. They stop revealing. Minimal encouragers thread the needle. They signal that you're listening, that you're engaged, that they should continue, without redirecting or interrupting. This technique comes from therapeutic listening and investigative interviewing. The goal is to keep the information flowing without imposing your own structure or agenda on it. Let me show you what this looks like. Someone is explaining a complex concern, maybe about budget constraints or team capacity or technical challenges. They're thinking aloud, working through the issue as they speak. Your instinct might be to interject, right? "So what you're saying is," or "have you considered," or "that reminds me of." Each of those interruptions, however well-intentioned, breaks their flow. They lose their train of thought. They stop revealing and start responding to you. But minimal encouragers do something different. You nod slightly. You maintain eye contact. You make a brief sound, hum. You say quietly, "I see." That's it. You're signaling attention without interrupting. And they continue, often revealing more detail, more nuance, more honesty than they would have if you'd broken the flow. And the other thing I'm worried about is that even if the budget works, I'm not sure my team has the technical capability to maintain this long term. We've had turnover, and the knowledge gap is real. That additional information, the real concern about technical capability, might never have emerged if you'd interrupted with your own thoughts earlier. Minimal encouragers work because they respect the other person's thought process. They create space for exploration rather than imposing structure. Practice this. When someone is explaining something important, resist the urge to jump in. Use minimal encouragers. Nod, hum, "I see," go on. Let them unfold their thinking. More often than not, the most valuable information comes at the end of that unfolding, not the beginning. Skill 47, the summarization check-in. Conversations drift. What starts as a discussion about timeline becomes a discussion about budget, becomes a discussion about team composition. And before you know it, you're no longer aligned on what you're even talking about. The summarization check-in prevents this. Every few minutes, you pause and summarize what you've heard. Not what you've said, what they've said. You give them a chance to confirm or correct. This technique serves multiple purposes. It confirms alignment, so you're both talking about the same thing. It prevents misunderstanding from compounding. And it demonstrates respect. You're showing that their input matters enough to be worth summarizing. This comes from comprehension verification practices in high-stakes communication, medicine, aviation, negotiation. When misunderstanding has real consequences, people build in regular check-ins to ensure alignment. Let me show you what this looks like. You're in a negotiation. The other person has spent 5 minutes explaining their needs, constraints, and priorities. It's been a lot of information. Instead of immediately responding with your proposal or your counter, you pause and summarize. Okay, let me make sure I've got this right. You need flexibility on timeline. You have a fixed budget of $50,000, and you're concerned about quality control throughout the process. Did I capture that correctly? You've just done several things. You've demonstrated that you were listening. You've given them a chance to correct anything you misunderstood. And you've created alignment before moving forward. Often, they'll correct or clarify. Yes, exactly. And the other thing is we need regular communication. We've had projects go sideways before because of lack of updates. You've just gotten additional information because you created space for it through summarization. The summarization check-in works because it slows the conversation down just enough to ensure you're not building on misunderstanding. It prevents the common problem where both parties think they've agreed but actually have completely different understandings of what was said. Use this regularly. After they explain something complex, summarize. After a long back and forth, pause and summarize where you are. Before moving to the next topic, summarize what you've agreed on so far. The time you spend summarizing is never wasted. It's insurance against misalignment that would cost much more to fix later. Skill 48. The assumption suspension. We listen through filters. We hear what someone says, but we interpret it through our own assumptions, our own experiences, our own expectations. Someone says, "This is too expensive," and we hear, "They don't have budget." But maybe they mean, "I don't see the value yet," or "I need to justify this to someone else," or "I'm afraid of making a mistake." Our assumptions about what they mean can be completely wrong. And when we respond to our assumptions rather than their actual meaning, we miss the mark entirely. The assumption suspension is about deliberately setting aside your interpretations, about pausing before responding and asking yourself, what if I'm wrong about what they mean? What else could this mean? This comes from cognitive empathy work, the practice of fully inhabiting someone else's perspective rather than projecting your own onto them. Let me show you the difference. Someone says, "I don't think we can afford this right now." Your assumption, they're concerned about cost. They don't have budget. You respond by offering payment plans or trying to justify the price. But what if you suspend that assumption? What if you listen again, without interpreting through the lens of cost? You ask, "Help me understand what's making this feel unaffordable right now." And they say, "It's not the money exactly. It's that we don't have the internal support to implement this. If we buy it and it just sits there unused, that's a waste." The real concern wasn't cost at all. It was implementation support. Your assumption led you in the wrong direction. Suspending that assumption and listening again revealed the real issue. The assumption suspension requires humility. It means admitting that your first interpretation might be wrong, that you need to check, to ask, to listen more deeply before responding. Practice this. Before responding to any important statement, pause internally and ask, what if I'm wrong about what they mean? What else could this mean? Then listen again, or ask a clarifying question, or simply sit with the ambiguity a moment longer. More often than not, when you suspend your assumptions, you discover that what you thought they meant was different from what they actually meant. And responding to their actual meaning is far more effective than responding to your assumption. Skill 49. The curiosity pivot. Disagreement is inevitable in negotiation. Someone will propose something you think won't work. They'll express a perspective you find flawed. They'll suggest a solution that seems obviously wrong to you. Your instinct in that moment is to counter, to argue, to explain why they're wrong and you're right. But there's another option, genuine curiosity. Instead of treating their statement as an argument to win, treat it as an opportunity to learn, to understand their reasoning, to discover what you might be missing. This is the curiosity pivot, and it transforms conflict into exploration. The principle comes from inquiry-based learning and collaborative problem-solving. When you approach disagreement with curiosity rather than certainty, you often discover common ground hidden beneath surface-level differences. Let me show you what this looks like. Someone proposes a solution you think is deeply flawed. Maybe it's expensive or impractical or misses the core problem entirely. Your instinct might be to say, "That won't work. Here's why." And now you're in debate mode. Your adversaries, each defending a position. But the curiosity pivot does something different. "That's interesting. Help me understand how you see that's solving the problem." You're not agreeing. You're not pretending to think it's a good idea, but you're approaching it with genuine curiosity about their reasoning. And they explain. And in explaining, one of several things happens. Sometimes they realize the flaws themselves. Well, when you put it that way, I guess it doesn't fully address. Sometimes you realize you misunderstood their proposal. "Oh, I thought you meant X, but you actually mean Y. That's different." Sometimes you discover their constraints or priorities that make their proposal make sense from their perspective. They're optimizing for speed because they have an external deadline I didn't know about. The curiosity pivot disarms conflict because it refuses to treat disagreement as combat. It treats it as information. And information is how you find creative solutions that neither of you would have discovered alone. Practice this. When someone says something you disagree with, resist the urge to counter immediately. Instead, ask with genuine curiosity, "Tell me more about that. Help me understand how you're thinking about this." Let them explain. Listen for the reasoning, the constraints, the perspective that makes their view make sense from where they're sitting. You might still disagree, but you'll disagree with better information. And often, you'll find that curiosity reveals paths to agreement that certainty would have closed off. Skill 50. The body language mirror listen. Your body knows things before your conscious mind does. When someone is speaking, your body is processing information about them, their tone, their energy, their truthfulness, at a level below conscious awareness. And your body responds. Your chest might tighten. Your shoulders might relax. Your jaw might clench. These physical responses are data. They're your unconscious mind communicating what it's picking up. This is somatic listening, paying attention to your own body's response as a source of information about the conversation. The principle comes from somatic psychology and intuition research. Your body processes emotional and social information faster and sometimes more accurately than your conscious reasoning. Learning to listen to those signals makes you a better listener overall. Let me show you what this looks like. You're in a negotiation. The other person is explaining their position. Their words sound reasonable. Their logic seems sound. But as they speak, you notice your chest tightening. There's a subtle tension in your shoulders. That's your body telling you something. Maybe it's picking up on vocal tone that suggests uncertainty. Maybe it's noticing micro-expressions that don't match the words. Maybe it's sensing incongruence that your conscious mind hasn't identified yet. You don't know exactly what triggered it, but your body sensed something off. Later in the conversation, they discuss a different topic. As they speak, you notice your shoulders drop. Your breathing deepens. You feel yourself relaxing. That's your body telling you it trusts what it's hearing. Some unconscious assessment has determined that this part of the conversation feels authentic, genuine, safe. The body language mirror listen isn't about making decisions based solely on gut feeling. It's about treating your somatic responses as additional data. When your body reacts, tension, relaxation, discomfort, ease, pause and ask yourself, what might my body be picking up on? What information is it processing that I'm not consciously aware of? Sometimes, when you ask that question, the answer becomes clear. You realize they were vague about something important, or they rushed past a topic, or their energy shifted when discussing a particular term. Other times, you don't find a clear answer, but you stay alert. Your body's response is a signal to pay closer attention. Practice this. As you listen, occasionally check in with your body. How does your chest feel? Your shoulders? Your jaw? What is your breath doing? When you notice physical reactions, treat them as information. Your body is listening too, and sometimes it hears things your mind misses. Conclusion. And there you have it, 50 psychological skills that can transform the way you negotiate. But here's what really matters. Negotiation isn't about winning. It's not about outsmarting people or deploying tactics like weapons. It's about understanding. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone involved, about building relationships that last beyond any single deal. You don't need to master all 50 of these skills overnight. Start with one. Maybe it's the anchoring preface, setting the first number with confidence. Maybe it's the tactical pause, giving yourself 3 seconds to think before responding. Maybe it's simply the pre-negotiation centering ritual, taking 2 minutes to breathe and center yourself before any important conversation. Pick one skill that resonates with you and practice it until it becomes instinctive. Then add another, then another. Because here's what I've discovered, negotiation skills compound. Each small shift in how you approach conversations creates ripples. The way you label obstacles changes how honestly people talk with you. The way you listen at 3 levels changes how deeply you understand. The way you ask calibrated questions changes confrontation into collaboration. These aren't manipulation tactics. They're the foundations of genuine, respectful communication. The most powerful negotiators aren't the ones who know the most tricks. They're the ones who've done the internal work, who can stay calm when emotions run high, who can listen when their instinct is to speak, who can walk away when their boundaries are crossed. That's not strategy. That's character. And character is what these 50 skills are really building. If this video added value to your life, hit that like button and subscribe. We're building a community of people who understand that success isn't about dominating others. It's about creating outcomes where everyone wins. Where relationships matter more than transactions. Where integrity is non-negotiable. Drop a comment and tell me, which skill are you going to practice first? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious which of these 50 resonated most with your situation. And remember, you already have everything you need to negotiate effectively. These skills aren't about becoming someone else. They're about removing the noise, the anxiety, the reactivity, the ego, so your best thinking can emerge. So your authentic presence can create the outcomes you deserve. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, go negotiate with confidence, with integrity, and with the knowledge that the best deals are the ones where everyone walks away satisfied.